Hello, SEBC Growth Groups. It's great to be back together again. And I trust that our time together over the next couple months will be profitable and help us all as we seek to follow God together. Sussex County Bible Church exists to glorify God wherever we are by making, maturing, and multiplying followers of Jesus here at home and abroad. Now, growth groups help us accomplish this mission by by providing relationships and connections for the maturing and the multiplying of believers here at home. Now, how does a Christian grow? How do they mature? We can think of it in three simple ways. We can mature as we grow in our knowledge, in our character, and our skill. A simple way to remember that is our head, our heart, and our hands. Our head, it's easy to think about, the things that we know, the facts, the information. Our heart refers to the things that we care about, the things that we worship, the things that we love, ultimately, our values. And our hands talk about what we're good at, the skills that we're developing, and our behavior. Now, I think we'd all be quick to admit that we live in a time where there's a lot of people that have a lot of head knowledge about God and about the gospel. We might be able to speak sound theology, but oftentimes that gospel truth doesn't really filter out into our lives. And so often our lives don't accurately reflect the gospel that we claim to be living for. So where does this disconnect come from? How can our knowledge of the gospel shape the values of our heart and the behaviors of our hands? Well, learning to process life biblically is this essential skill that helps us bridge the gap between our head and our hearts, between our knowledge and between our character. So how does God do that? How does God bridge this gap? How does He move us past just knowing all this amazing thing, this amazing truth about who God is and what He's done for us in a way that transforms our lives? Well, whether we realize it or not, God is actively involved in our daily lives. He's orchestrating experiences to bring us where we need to be, to learn lessons that we need to learn, so that we can humbly respond in obedience and become more and more like Christ, so that we can mature. Well, if that's what God is doing, we need to learn how to live every day of our life in a way that is sensitive to that, in a way that is aware of the fact that God is at work, God wants me to grow, and God is actively involved in my daily life. So here's another way of thinking about that. If we're going to recognize this essential truth that God is sovereignly involved in every believer's life, in every person's life, directing and controlling according to His good and perfect plan, then we need to learn how to respond to that. We need to learn how to learn. Now, one of the first books that I had to read in seminary almost made me laugh when I bought it. It was a book that I can't remember exactly what the title was, but it was something like How to Read a Book and How to Write a Paper. And I'm thinking, all right, I've graduated from college, I'm in seminary, and this is the book that I've got to read. But man, it was very, very helpful. And through reading and studying and applying some of the lessons that I learned in that book, I was able to read faster and with more retention. I learned how to read in a way that would help me in writing papers and on future assignments and things like that. It was extremely valuable. It helped me, even though I thought I already knew how to learn and read a book and write a paper. It helped me learn how to learn. And that's what we would like to see happening here in the next several months as we gather together. We want to help each other learn how to learn from God, how to be sensitive to His working in our lives in a way that helps us to respond, not the way that we normally and naturally respond, but to respond in a way that leads us to become more and more like Christ. So the things that we know to be true about God start shaping what we care about and what we do. Now, we see this demonstrated often in the Bible, that God uses daily circumstances and events to help His people to recognize the truth and to grow and become more like Christ. Now, one of the most obvious examples, I think, is found in a really well-known period of Israel's history. That weird kind of unusual time where they were wandering in the wilderness. It was a transition from when God redeemed them and rescued them from slavery in Egypt and was moving them to this land of peace and rest that He had promised them. And in this in-between time, God was not wasting the opportunities of their daily lives. Instead, He was actively involved in leading them in unexpected ways and places to confront them with the things that they needed to learn. Now let's look together at Deuteronomy chapter 8, because here we find the people of Israel after this 40-year wanderings, this 11-day trip that turned into 40 years. God lets them know extremely clearly that this wasn't just some random accident that happened that caused them to be lost for 40 years. No, it was a part of God's plan. He was working and moving in their midst to accomplish his purpose. So what was God up to? What was he doing? Consider this verse together. Deuteronomy 8 verse 2 says, "And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not." Now here's the thing that might be helpful to think about. If you were to go to any of those Israelites just after they had seen God display his power in the 10 plagues, demonstrate that he was sovereign over all those false idols and false gods that the people of Egypt were worshiping, and provided this great rescue and humbled Pharaoh, the most powerful leader in the world at the time, into a place where he was saying, "Go and get away from here." If you were to go up to any of those Israelites and hold a microphone in front of their face and say, "After all the things that you have seen God do, will you obey God? Will you do what he tells you to do?" What do you think the typical, average, in fact, normal response would be from the people of Israel? Oh, 100%, absolutely, yes, I'm going to obey. I love God. I'm so thankful that he answered our prayers, that he is leading us from Egypt. I can't wait to get to the promised land, and we are going to be God's people and do God's will. I mean, that would be a normal response, right? But God knows their hearts, and he led them on this journey to expose the truth that even though they thought they loved God, even though they thought they wanted to obey and honor him with their lives, the truth was their hearts were far from God. And so God is moving in their midst in unexpected ways. And we can talk a lot more about these verses, but I want to just point out three simple things. When it came to the spiritual care of the people of Israel, God was the one who was the primary discipler. God is our primary discipler. And secondly, I want to point out the way he does that is in everyday experiences. God used the everyday experiences and the difficulties that these people experienced, not just the difficulties, but also the joys and the thankful and abundant provision of God. But God used everyday experiences to disciple his people. And then third, I want to point out that God did that in a community of his people. Now, God had this plan. God was working, discipling them, leading them in everyday circumstances to show them the truth about their own hearts, to bring them to a place where they could humbly obey God within a community of people who are all experiencing the same things together. And how did they respond? They were stubborn, obstinate, they were resistant, and they were typically blind. So what if the people of Israel, instead of being blind and resistant to the discipling work of God in their midst, what if they honed their skills so that they were able to see and hear and recognize God's work in their hearts and in the lives of the people around them? What if we can develop our skills and abilities so that we're sensitive to recognize God's work, so that we can see it and hear it and respond in a way that demonstrates humble obedience and results in growth and maturity? What if we can learn to process life biblically, so that as we experience our daily life, we can see the things that God is doing from his eyes, recognizing he is at work? What if our responses were not just our responses, but they were responses that were Christ-like? What if the communication, the things that I say as I think about the experiences that God is bringing into my life, aren't just demonstrating a heart that is far from God and stubborn, but they demonstrate that heart that is filled with and reflecting the truth of God's word? What if my decisions based on the experiences of my life and the things that I say and talk about with my friends and community, what if those things were conduits of change so I could become more and more like Christ? See, that's the goal of this course, our time together. We want to see through gathering together and learning to process life biblically, to recognize that by God's grace, we can be able to biblically process every moment of life as it relates to learning to be conformed to the image of Christ.
Hi, everybody. As you start this study together, one of the things you will be receiving is a journal. Now, this journal can turn into a spiritual transformation journal. It can become a tool that you use as you go through the process of understanding God's work in your life. I personally have used journals for many years, like this one, where I've been able to track God's work in my life through the different experiences and Him pointing out to me where He wants to apply His truth. So the journal gives us an opportunity to be able to each day or a few times a week, whatever you're able to do, to be able to take the truth that God is showing you through His Word, how God is using the experiences in your life to reveal areas in your heart, and you can begin to see visually as you write things down, visually connecting the dots together. It's a discipline that many people don't have, but should have, right? It's a discipline that will produce lots of fruit. So I would encourage you, as you get these journals, to take time as part of your walk and your desire to be spiritually transformed, to take time to use a journal to be able to track what God is doing in your life.